Chapter 10. Carl. Carl woke the next morning to the sounds of breakfast being made in the kitchen. His eyes snapped open to realize there was also light in the cabin. He was usually up before the sun, so how had he slept so long? But as he moved to get up, he realized how. There was a massive crick in his neck from sleeping in the chair. No doubt he hadn't slept well from the position he'd been in. He stretched and massaged his neck, and when he felt like the pain had lessened, he stood. At least his foot seemed better this morning. There was less pain as he made his way into the kitchen. "Good morning," Elizabeth said, putting a plate of breakfast on the table. "I wasn't sure if I should wake you or let you sleep."
"I'm usually up before the sun, so you won't have to worry about it. But I suppose I'm glad we decided to go to town today, so I don't feel so behind on my chores."
He pulled out his chair and sat down, his stomach rumbling at the delicious aroma of the plate before him. "Thank you again for taking me today. I know it takes time away from your work, but maybe I can help when we return?"
"Perhaps."
He did hope that Elizabeth would be able to help soon, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. It was only her second day here, and he had no doubt she was dealing with quite the adjustment. After breakfast, he hitched the wagon, and soon they were on their way into town. The ride was quiet, but not entirely uncomfortable. Still, he was relieved when the general store came into view. He pulled the horses to a stop and jumped down to tie them before helping Elizabeth down. He looked up at her as he held out his hand. She smiled as she placed her hand in his, but she let go as soon as her feet touched the ground. Carl tried not to see it as an affront. After all, they were still strangers, but he couldn't help wondering when that would change. When would she be comfortable around him? And perhaps more importantly, when would he be allowed back in his bed? He certainly couldn't afford any more late mornings. The tiny bell jingled as they entered the store, and Mr. Brown looked up from the counter. He'd had the bell installed a year ago, even though the store wasn't big enough to need one. He'd claimed it was so he could hear people enter, even if he was in the back. But as he was rarely anywhere other than behind the counter, Carl figured he had done it for the audible reminder of clients.
"Good morning, Carl. Who is this lovely lady with you?"
Carl glanced over at Elizabeth, whose cheeks had turned a rosy pink color.
"Good morning, Mr. Brown. This is my wife, Elizabeth. She arrived from Chicago yesterday and realized there were a few things she needed for the homestead."
He stepped closer to Elizabeth and pointed to the far left corner of the store.
"The fabric is in the back corner if you'd like to start there."
"That would be nice. Thank you." As she walked away, he stepped closer to Mr. Brown, sure that the man would have questions.
"Chicago, huh? The mail-order bride ad?"
Carl nodded.
"Thank you for helping me place that, by the way. She's having to adjust to the smaller town, but I'm hoping I can introduce her to some of the women and make her feel more connected."
Mr. Brown nodded and scratched his chin as he watched Elizabeth.
"Well, Mrs. Cook is usually in before noon to grab items for the clinic and the like. Maybe she can help." "That's what I'm hoping. Thank you."
Carl walked over to Elizabeth and watched as her fingers trailed over the fabric. It was clear that she had an eye for such things, and he wondered how much the particular piece she was looking at would cost him. He knew there would be more money involved once he married. After all, he was feeding another mouth as well. But he had forgotten that she might want to spend money on things he'd had no need of before. Fabrics, perfumes, and the like. Where would that extra money come from? She'd said she'd brought a little with her, but could he really ask her to pay? After all, she'd left her entire life in Chicago to come and marry him. Yes, she'd done it willingly, but as a husband, wasn't it his duty to supply her needs as well?
"Do you like that one?"
he asked as he stepped to her side. Startled, she pulled her hand back before turning to look at him. "I do, but I don't have enough to afford it."
"How much is it?"
Her eyes widened and she shook her head. "No, I can't ask you to do that. It's too much."
"Why don't you let me be the judge of that? How much?"
"It's $1.30 for the bolt, as it's silk." She pressed her lips together as his eyes grew. "It's too much and not necessary. It would be the perfect fabric for a lovely fancy dress, but I don't even know when I would need one now. It makes much more sense to get the more practical fabric." She reached for the print gingham that was a few bolts over and held it up. "This could make a lovely new dress, and it's much more affordable."
"You seem to know quite a bit about fabric."
Elizabeth sighed. "Well, it is rather expected that women learn about fabric and sewing, but I've always enjoyed sewing. Back in Chicago, I used to dream about having my own dress shop where I could make clothes for other women." Carl's brow lifted.
"Why didn't you do it?"
Elizabeth smiled sadly and shook her head. "It's an unrealistic dream. Not only would it cost too much to open a store like that, but most women sew their own clothes. What need would they have of a seamstress? Plus, when my father got sick, all my time had to go into caring for him, and when he passed, there was no money."
"I'm sorry about your father, but I'm sure there are some women who do not find sewing as enjoyable as you do that would benefit greatly."
"That is true, but it wouldn't be affordable. You balked at the cost of simply purchasing the silk fabric. Imagine how much more expensive it would be if you had to pay someone to make the dress." Carl's face paled for a second in shock before he shook his head. Knowing how tight money was in the town, he was almost certain no one would be able to afford that. But he didn't want to discourage Elizabeth either.
"Perhaps they couldn't afford a fancy dress, but could afford a print one."
Elizabeth pressed her lips together and looked back at the fabric. "I'm not sure. Obviously, you know this town better than I do, but I can't imagine there are many women who could afford to purchase a dress rather than make it themselves."
"What about teaching them? Maybe they couldn't afford to buy a dress, but I know the women get together to quilt. What if you charged a small fee for lessons to help them improve?"
"It's possible, I suppose. Maybe when I know more people, I'll look into it." Carl nodded. He could tell she was humoring him, but he wanted to get her involved in the town. He wanted her to be more comfortable, but he knew he couldn't push her too hard or she might shut down entirely. He just wished there was something he could do to help her feel more comfortable. Thankfully, the bell jingled again, and Carl looked up to see Emma Cook enter. Things were still a little uncomfortable between them, but he knew that Emma would try to make the new woman feel welcome.
"Mrs. Cook!"
He raised his voice to call his old friend over. Emma looked up and offered a small smile. They had once been close, having grown up in town together, but Carl had strained the relationship by trying to get her to marry him when she wasn't interested. He'd apologized, but it was clear there was still some unease between them. "Mr. Baxter," she said, using his proper name as well.
"I'd like to introduce my wife Elizabeth to you."
A flicker of surprise crossed Emma's features before she schooled her face and smiled widely at Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, what a pleasure to meet you." Emma extended her hand. "I'm Emma Cook. When did you get to town?" "Just yesterday," Elizabeth said softly. "Well, then you have to come to the sewing circle this Sunday. It will be a perfect place for you to meet some of the women of the town." She turned to Carl. "You'll bring her, won't you? William and I can take her home after so you don't have to make another trip."
"Of course."
Carl nodded and offered her a relieved smile. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Wonderful. I can't wait to hear all about your journey and how you're liking the town," Emma said. "Don't forget to bring something to work on. I wish I could talk more now, but I'm in a bit of a hurry." Carl turned to Elizabeth, expecting to see the same smile on her face that filled his. But instead, an angry red colored her face and her eyes flashed at him. "Why didn't you ask if I wanted to go before accepting?" Elizabeth whispered. Carl blinked at her, startled by her reaction.
"I'm sorry. I didn't think it would be a big deal. I thought you would want to meet other women. Was I wrong?"
Elizabeth sighed and shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. I'm happy to meet other women, but I would appreciate it if you would ask me and not blindly accept things for me." There was obviously something more behind her reaction, but Carl didn't want to press her for the information here. Still, he would have to probe more into the situation later. She had to understand that she couldn't address him that way in public.
"I guess there are aspects to this marriage that we both need to adjust to."
She pressed her lips together and folded her arms across her chest. "I suppose there are." Silence filled the space between them, and for a brief moment Carl wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. What if this woman was a shrew and wanted to rule the house that way? That was not the kind of woman he wanted to start a family with. But then he remembered that her life had recently been turned upside down. She'd lost her father and her home, and she was bound to need some time to adjust to this new life. He took a deep breath before speaking again.
"Shall we get the rest of the items we need and be going then? I do need to get to work on the farm."
Elizabeth nodded, and they gathered up the rest of the supplies on her list before taking everything to the counter.
"It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Baxter,"
Mr. Brown said as he began totaling their items.
"I heard Mrs. Cook invite you to the sewing circle. That's a fantastic way to meet some of the women of the town."
"Yes, it sounds wonderful," Elizabeth said, but Carl could still hear the tightness in her voice. He'd only been trying to help, but he was beginning to wonder if they would ever have the kind of marriage that Jessie and Kate or William and Emma did.